In the final days of October 1944, in the darkness before dawn, soldiers of the 442nd Regimental combat team prepared to march into hell. Around them, the Vosges Mountains of northeastern France loomed like the walls of a fortress, shrouded in freezing rain and impenetrable fog. Each man gripped the pack of the soldier ahead because visibility had dropped to nothing. It was, as one would later recall, blacker than the inside of a wolf. They had just fought for 9 straight days to liberate the French towns of Bruyères and Bifontaine. They had been promised 5 days of rest. They got less than 24 hours. These soldiers were Japanese Americans, Nisei, second generation. While they prepared to fight and die for the United States Army, many of their families sat behind barbed wire in internment camps back home, branded as enemy aliens. Now they were being ordered into terrain no army had successfully breached since the Roman Empire, to attempt what 2 other battalions had already failed to do: rescue 275 men of the Texas National Guard, trapped behind enemy lines, surrounded by 6,000 German troops. And the decision their commanding officer made in that moment, his final instruction before they set out, would lead to one of the bloodiest and most controversial rescue missions in American military history. Before the story continues, a note on our mission. This narrative is a 100% fact-checked account based on hours of research into primary historical sources, such as U.S. Army combat records, presidential unit citation documents, declassified military memoranda, Congressional Medal of Honor citations, veteran oral histories archived by the Densho Project, and historical analyses, including Franz Steidel's Lost Battalions, Going for Broke in the Vosges. The images you are seeing are atmospheric. They are not a literal, moment-by-moment recreation of the narrative. Their sole purpose is to create a mood. Think of this as a historical audiobook with visual accompaniment. If you believe true stories are more powerful than fiction, please support our mission of telling them by liking and subscribing. Now, the story continues. October 24th, 1944. The Vosges Forest, Eastern France. The 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, a Texas National Guard unit, had been advancing through dense woodland toward the German border. They were 275 men. They moved quickly through the towering pines, taking advantage of recent Allied games, pushing to secure territory near the French town of Saint-Dié. Their commanding officer was Major General John Dahlquist of the 36th Infantry Division, a 48-year-old general who had assured his troops they would meet only light resistance. There were no Germans in the area, he said. He was catastrophically wrong. The German forces had been watching, waiting. The Texans marched 4 miles forward and occupied 2 hills outside the village of Bifontaine, unaware they were walking into a trap. The Germans allowed them to pass, then struck from behind with devastating precision. Within hours, the 1st Battalion was cut off. The Germans sealed every escape route with landmines, machine gun nests, and artillery positions. The battalion was surrounded on all sides. Communication lines went dead. They were trapped on a steep ridge, 7 miles behind enemy lines, with dwindling ammunition and no way out. The situation was desperate. The trapped soldiers had no resupply, food was running out, medical supplies were nearly gone. The cold October rain turned foxholes into muddy pools. German snipers picked off anyone who moved. German artillery pounded their position day and night. The men huddled in the cellars of abandoned buildings and shallow trenches, waiting for rescue that never came. P-47 Thunderbolt fighters from the 405th Fighter Squadron attempted airdrops, but the dense forest canopy caused most supplies to fall among the German positions instead. What little reached the trapped battalion was not enough. They were bleeding men every hour. Back at headquarters, General Dahlquist ordered rescue attempts. On October 25th, the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 141st tried to break through. They were repelled with heavy casualties. German defenses were too strong. The terrain was impossible. The Vosges Mountains were over 1,000 feet high, covered in thick pine forest, seeded with mines and booby traps. The Germans had turned the forest into a killing field. Every approach was pre-registered for artillery fire. Machine gun nests were dug into positions with overlapping fields of fire. Roadblocks choked the few narrow trails. The weather made air support impossible. Fog, rain, and low clouds grounded Allied aircraft. On October 26th, another rescue attempt failed. More casualties. The Germans were dug in, fortified, confident. They were defending the last natural barrier before the Rhine River itself. They had no intention of giving ground. Inside the German command, intelligence reports confirmed what their field officers already knew. An entire American battalion was cut off. Adolf Hitler himself received word of the situation. His order was absolute. The lost battalion must not be rescued. Hold the position at all costs. By the evening of October 26th, the situation had become critical. Of the original 275 men, dozens were already dead or wounded. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. The men were cold, wet, and running out of hope. A 36-man patrol had attempted a breakout. Only 5 returned. The battalion had earned a new name: the Lost Battalion. General Dahlquist faced a decision. 2 battalions of his own regiment had failed to break through. He needed a unit capable of the impossible. At 2:30 in the afternoon of October 25th, Dahlquist visited the headquarters of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The Japanese-American soldiers had just finished 9 days of brutal combat. They had liberated Bruyères and Bifontaine at terrible cost, losing many of their most experienced officers and men. They were exhausted, battle-scarred, and promised 5 days of rest. Dahlquist cancelled it. He ordered them back to the line immediately. Their mission: break through to the Lost Battalion, at any cost. The soldiers of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team carried a burden no other American unit bore. They were fighting under a cloud of suspicion. On February 19, 1942, just 2 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had signed Executive Order 9066. The order authorized the forced removal and incarceration of over 120,000 Japanese Americans from the West Coast. They were given 48 hours' notice. Families lost homes, businesses, farms. Everything they had built was stolen or sold at fire sale prices. They were transported to concentration camps in remote desert locations: Manzanar, Tule Lake, Hart Mountain, Topaz, Poston. Barracks surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. Prison in all but name. Many of the soldiers now marching toward the Lost Battalion had volunteered from these camps. When the War Department called for volunteers in 1943, over 10,000 men from Hawaii stepped forward immediately. On the mainland, where families remained imprisoned, only 1,256 volunteered initially. They were asked to sign loyalty oaths, to swear allegiance to the country that had branded them enemy aliens. Those who did were drafted anyway. Private Arthur Iwasaki was drafted in March 1942. While he trained at Camp Shelby, Mississippi, his family was forcibly relocated to the Nyssa labor camp in Oregon. This was the ghost that haunted every man in the 442nd. They were fighting for a country that did not trust them, fighting to prove their loyalty while their families lived behind barbed wire. Fighting, as one soldier later said, to buy an awful big hunk of America with their blood. The order came down on the afternoon of October 25, 1944. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team would advance immediately. No rest, no reprieve. They would march 9 miles through enemy-held forest in complete darkness, freezing rain, and fog so thick a man could not see his own hand in front of his face. They would assault fortified German positions that had already repelled 2 rescue attempts. They would do what no other unit had been able to do: reach the lost battalion. The order came from General Dahlquist. The reaction from the officers and men of the 442nd was fury. They had just fought for 9 consecutive days. They had suffered heavy casualties liberating 2 towns. They were promised rest. Now this. And the question burned in every man's mind: why us? As Larry Sakota would later ask, why not use the other regiments? Why not Dahlquist's own men? Why send only the Japanese unit? Was it because they were expendable? But the order stood. The 442nd's commanding officers, white men who had led these soldiers through Italy and France, protested. They argued for time to rest and resupply. They argued for a flanking maneuver instead of a frontal assault. General Dahlquist overruled them. The attack would be frontal. It would be immediate, and it would succeed, no matter the cost. On the afternoon of October 25th, the men of the 442nd received their orders. They checked their weapons. They filled their canteens. They wrote final letters home. They knew what was coming. Many would not return. But they had a motto: go for broke. Hawaiian slang for shoot the works. Risk it all in one effort to win big. They had chosen that motto themselves. Now they would live it, or die by it. At 0230 hours on October 26, 1944, the 442nd began their march into the Vosges. Each man held on to the pack of the man ahead. The rain was icy. The mud was ankle-deep and sticky. The fog was absolute. They could hear German artillery in the distance. They could hear the occasional crack of rifle fire. They moved in silence, one step at a time, into terrain that had defeated every army that had tried to take it for 2,000 years. The 100th Infantry Battalion led the advance. Behind them came the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 442nd. Supporting them were the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion and the 232nd Combat Engineer Company. Approximately 800 men in total. Their mission was to punch through miles of German defenses, reach 275 trapped Texans, and bring them home. This was the Gambit. A desperate, 1 in a million frontal assault through the most defensible terrain in Western Europe, with exhausted troops, in impossible weather, against an enemy ordered by Hitler himself to prevent the rescue at all costs. The risk was total annihilation. The Germans outnumbered them 4-1 at certain points. The terrain gave every advantage to the defender. One wrong step meant a mine. One moment of exposure meant a sniper's bullet or an artillery shell. If they failed, 275 men would die or be captured. But if they did not try, those men were already dead, and the 442nd would carry the shame of not attempting the impossible. So they marched into the darkness, and the forest closed around them like a fist. The forest was a nightmare made real. The Vosges Mountains rose over 1,000 feet, covered in dense stands of pine trees so thick that daylight barely penetrated. The ground was a maze of steep ridges, narrow ravines, and trails barely wide enough for a single file of men. Every open patch was mined. Every approach was pre-registered by German artillery. The Germans had spent weeks fortifying their positions. They knew every field of fire, every choke point, every killing zone. The 442nd was advancing into a meat grinder. The soldiers moved in the pre-dawn darkness of October 26th. The rain came down in sheets, soaking through uniforms, filling boots, turning the earth into slick mud. The fog was so dense that soldiers literally could not see the man in front of them unless they were touching his pack. Matt Sakamoto later recalled, "It was pitch dark when we started out. Each man had to hold on to the backpack of the man in front because you couldn't see him, even though he was walking just in front of you. And it was drizzling, and the mud was ankle deep. The mud was so sticky it was hard to take steps." They advanced in silence, knowing that every sound could draw fire. The first contact came at dawn. German machine guns opened up from concealed positions on the high ground. The sound was deafening. Tracer rounds cut through the fog like red lines of death. Men dove for cover. The 442nd returned fire, but they could barely see their targets. The Germans were dug into bunkers, reinforced with logs and earth. Mortar rounds began falling, then artillery. The ground erupted. Trees shattered. Shrapnel screamed through the air like 1,000 knives. Combat medic Victor Izui later described the terrain as the most god-awful terrain and weather in the dark, jungle-like Vosges forest. A series of unmaneuverable, long, narrow ridges. Cold rain and more cold rain. A well-camouflaged, well-dug-in, tenacious enemy we couldn't see. Waterlogged foxholes and soggy combat boots. The advance slowed to a crawl. Yards were measured in blood. Every ridge had to be taken by frontal assault. Every German position had to be cleared by hand grenades and rifles. The forest amplified every sound. The crack of a rifle, the scream of a wounded man, the whistle of incoming shells. The soldiers learned a new horror: tree bursts. German artillery shells were fused to explode when they struck the tops of trees. The shrapnel showered down from above, turning the forest into a death trap. Foxholes offered no protection. Men were hit from above, below, and from all sides. On October 27th, the 442nd pushed deeper into the forest. They were now 3 miles from the lost battalion, but those 3 miles might as well have been 30. The Germans were fighting with the courage of desperation. They knew their backs were to the German border. Every yard of ground they gave up brought the Allies closer to the Rhine, closer to the heart of the Reich. They fought with everything they had: machine guns, mortars, artillery, snipers, roadblocks made of felled trees and barbed wire, mines that turned trails into death traps. The 442nd lost men every hour, killed, wounded, missing. The casualty count climbed. The lines were so close that Private George Sakato later reported that when American artillery fired, the Nice soldiers had to jump into any available hole to avoid being hit by their own shells. The Germans were within grenade range, sometimes within knife range. This was not modern warfare. This was combat that would have been familiar to soldiers from the First World War. Men fought with bayonets. They fought with rifle butts. They fought with their bare hands in the mud and blood and rain. The nights were the worst. The temperature dropped. The rain turned to sleet. The soldiers huddled in shallow foxholes filled with water, shivering, unable to light fires for fear of drawing artillery. They ate cold rations. They tried to sleep but could not. German patrols probed their lines. Snipers fired at any sound. The darkness was filled with the screams of wounded men calling for medics. Some screamed in English, some in German. In the darkness, it was impossible to tell friend from enemy. Men died of exposure, of exhaustion, of wounds that would have been survivable in better conditions. October 28th. The 442nd had been fighting for 3 days straight. They had advanced less than 2 miles. Casualties were mounting to catastrophic levels. Companies that had started with 180 men were down to fewer than 50. Officers were killed. Sergeants took command. Sergeants were killed. Corporates took command. The men were beyond exhaustion. They were operating on instinct and sheer will. Some soldiers later said they could not remember entire hours of the battle. The mind shut down. The body moved on autopilot. Kill or be killed. Advance or die. On the afternoon of October 28th, the 442nd reached a position the soldiers would later call Suicide Hill. It was a steep ridge held by German forces in reinforced positions. Taking it meant a frontal assault up open ground under withering fire. There was no other way. Private Barney Hajiro led a bayonet charge. The men screamed and rushed forward. They fired as they ran. German machine guns cut them down. Men fell. Others took their places. They reached the German trenches and fought hand to hand. Grenades, bayonets, rifle butts. Private Ichiji Kashiwagi of K Company later recalled, "We yelled our heads off and charged and shot the head off everything that moved. We didn't care anymore. We acted like a bunch of savages." The Germans broke. They abandoned the position and fell back. The 442nd had taken Suicide Hill. The cost was staggering. Companies emerged with fewer than 20 men. Company I went in with 185 soldiers. Only 8 came out unwounded. Company K engaged with 186 men. When the fighting stopped, 169 were wounded or killed. The unit was being bled white, but they were closing the distance. The lost battalion was now less than a mile away. October 29th. The 442nd launched their final push. They had been fighting for 4 days with almost no sleep. They were out of food, low on ammunition, down to a fraction of their strength. But the lost battalion was within reach. During the fighting that day, Private George Sakato found himself in a ditch with an old friend from Arizona, Private Saburo Tanamachi. They had both been interned with their families before the war. As German artillery pounded their position, the two men talked. They talked about home, about Arizona, about the life they had before the war, the life before Executive Order 9066. It was a brief moment of peace in the middle of hell. Then the Germans counterattacked. Sakato watched Germans reach the hill above his position. He saw his friend's face. He felt something snap inside him. Rage. Pure, unfiltered rage. Grabbing a Thompson submachine gun, he charged up the hill alone. Bullets screamed past him. He zigzagged, firing from the hip. He killed 5 Germans, forced 4 more to surrender. When his platoon tried to regroup, a German counterattack hit their left flank. Staccato took command of his squad after his squad leader was killed. Using a captured German rifle and a P-38 pistol, he single-handedly stopped the attack. By the end of the day, 34 Germans had surrendered to his position. The night of October 29th was hell. The rain continued. The cold was bone deep. The soldiers of the 442nd knew they were close. They could hear American voices in the distance. They could hear the Germans firing at the trapped Texans. One more push. Just one more. At dawn on October 30th, the 442nd Artillery laid down a final barrage. The shells screamed overhead and detonated among the German positions. Then the infantry moved forward. The Germans fought back with everything they had left: machine guns, mortars, rifles. But the Nisei would not stop. They had come too far, lost too many men. They advanced through the fire, yard by yard, minute by minute, until finally, in the early afternoon of October 30th, 1944, they broke through. The first soldier of the 442nd to reach the lost battalion was Mat Sakamoto. He emerged from the forest covered in mud and blood and saw men in American uniforms huddled in foxholes and trenches. They looked at him in disbelief. Japanese faces, American uniforms. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Sakamoto did what soldiers do. He pulled out a pack of cigarettes and asked if anyone needed a smoke. Ed Guy, one of the trapped Texans, later recalled the moment. "I might have hugged him, I don't know. I was just excited to get out of there. The lost battalion had held out for 6 days. Of the original 275 men who had been trapped, 211 remained alive. They were out of ammunition, nearly out of food. Many were wounded. All were on the edge of collapse. As the soldiers of the 442nd began helping the Texans out of their positions, the reality of what they had accomplished began to sink in. They had done the impossible. They had marched through hell and brought these men home. But the price was written on every face. The 442nd had started the rescue mission with approximately 800 men. By the time they reached the lost battalion, they had suffered over 800 casualties. More men lost than saved. 184 killed. Over 600 wounded. Some companies had been reduced to fewer than 10 effective soldiers. The rescue was complete, but General Dahlquist was not finished. Instead of pulling the shattered 442nd off the line for the rest they so desperately needed, he ordered them to continue the attack. Push forward. Take the next objective. The men were incredulous, furious. They had just completed one of the most brutal rescue missions in military history. They had casualties exceeding 100%. And now this. The 442nd remained in combat for another 9 days. 9 more days of fighting, bleeding, dying. When they were finally relieved on November 9th, the unit was a shadow of itself. Of the 4,000 men who had entered the Vosges campaign, fewer than 1,000 remained fit for duty. On November 12, 1944, General Dahlquist ordered a parade review to thank the 442nd for their service. When the unit assembled, Dahlquist looked at the sparse formation and grew irritated. He demanded to know why so few men had turned out. He took it as a personal affront. He accused the unit of not showing proper respect. Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Miller, now commanding the 442nd after Colonel Charles Pence had been wounded during the rescue, looked at the general. His face was hard. His voice was steady. He said, "This is all that is left, sir." The men standing in formation were the survivors. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. Dahlquist had not understood the cost. He had not comprehended the price his orders had extracted. The officers and men of the 442nd stood in the cold November rain and watched their general's face as the truth settled on him. The 442nd had rescued 211 men at the cost of over 800 casualties. Throughout the entire Vosges campaign, including the battles for Bruyères, Bifontaine, and the Lost Battalion, the 442nd suffered approximately 150 killed and 1,800 wounded. The unit received 5 Presidential Unit citations for their actions in the Vosges. Private Barney Hajiro, Private James Okubo, Private George Sakato, Staff Sergeant Robert Kuroda, and Private Joe Nishimoto all received the Medal of Honor for their actions during the campaign, though most were not upgraded from lesser medals until the year 2000. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team became the most decorated unit in United States military history for its size and length of service. And the question that haunted every survivor was simple. Was it worth it? The rescue of the Lost Battalion raised questions that have never been fully answered. Was the 442nd used as cannon fodder? Were they given the most dangerous missions because they were expendable, or because they were the best? The men themselves had no doubt. They believed they were being used. But they went anyway. They fought anyway. They died anyway. Because they had something to prove. Not just to the United States Army. Not just to General Dahlquist. To the entire country. In 1962, Texas Governor John Connally made all members of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team honorary Texans in appreciation for their sacrifice. It was a gesture of recognition, decades overdue. In 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, which formally apologized for the internment of Japanese Americans and provided reparations to survivors. In 2000, Congress reviewed the combat records of Asian American veterans and upgraded 20 Distinguished Service Crosses to Medals of Honor, including those earned by soldiers of the 442nd during the Vosges campaign. In 2011, the 442nd and the 100th Infantry Battalion were collectively awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. The soldiers of the 442nd did more than rescue a lost battalion. They proved something that should never have needed proving. That loyalty is not a matter of race. That courage has no color. That Americans are defined not by their ancestry, but by their willingness to sacrifice for each other. The battle for the Lost Battalion was studied at West Point as an example of small unit tactics under impossible conditions. The towns of Bruyères and Bifontaine erected monuments to the 442nd, and their streets bear the names of the Nice soldiers who liberated them. And in 2012, all surviving members of the 442nd were made Chevalier of the French Légion d'honneur for their actions during the liberation of France. The legacy of the 442nd is simple. They were the best, not despite their ancestry, because of who they chose to be. President Harry Truman stood before the assembled men of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and pinned the Presidential Distinguished Unit citation to their colors. He looked at the soldiers, many still bearing the scars of the Vosges, and said, "You fought the enemy abroad and prejudice at home, and you won." Truman understood what these men had done. They had bought their citizenship with blood. They had earned their place in history by refusing to quit when every rational calculation said they should. The story of the 442nd is not just a story of military valor. It is a story about the price of belonging, about what it means to be American when America does not fully accept you, about fighting for a country that imprisoned your family, about proving your loyalty to people who doubted it from the start. The men of the 442nd paid a price that should never have been asked of them, but they paid it willingly, because they believed in something larger than themselves. They believed in the promise of America, even when America failed to live up to its promise to them. And in the dark forests of the Vosges Mountains, in the mud and blood and rain, they wrote a chapter of American history that will never be forgotten. Their motto was "Go for broke," and they meant it. The story of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team and their rescue of the lost battalion is one of thousands that deserve to be told. If you believe that true courage deserves to be remembered, please like, subscribe, and comment below with other stories you would like to see. Because these stories matter. These sacrifices matter. And as long as we remember them, the men who made them will never truly die.